others? What if they don't? Or what if we're not even concerned with whether they pose a real risk to others? There again, I'm more uncertain. Certainly, if we're going to have LWOP, and it's not going to degrade, and it's compatible with dignity, it will have to be an LWOP where there's real chances for human improvement within prison, where your regime can change, where you are under less control, where you maybe go outdoors, where you have more contact with the world. Certainly, it would involve compassionate release. Compassionate release is a really interesting question that now hangs over a lot of American justice systems with all of these aging LWOP prisoners, and that is there some basic right to not die in prison? Even if you're going to be held for the rest of your life, should you be released to die, at least in a kind of community hospice, rather than in a prison where you might be chained to your bed as you're dying and not able to be in contact with your family? In much of the world, I think there's a very strong commitment to compassionate release. The U.S. is an outlier in using it very, very rarely. California has been particularly egregious. But now, because of the medical case, there's certainly some self-interest in moving people out. Sometimes you can spend more money in the last 6 months of your life from a health insurance point of view than in the earlier periods combined. Anyway, I'm trying not to leave you with a more decisive answer to the question of dignity and life without parole. I would certainly much prefer a parole system that would consider people for release. The English have a system which I think we ought to consider adopting for murder sentences. They give the judge the right to set what's called a tariff, and that is a minimum amount of time that somebody's going to spend in prison on their life sentence. That is explicitly supposed to be based on retributive and deterrent considerations. That's something I think a trial judge can do. They can listen to the victims, they can look closely at what the person did and try to decide what they deserve and what would be necessary to deter. But after the tariff is passed, your continued incarceration is only justifiable if you pose a risk to the community. And that judgment should be made, according to the European Courts of Human Rights, not by a political officer like the Attorney General or the Home Secretary, but by an insulated body that can be protected from the kind of public backlash against releasing a very unpopular but not dangerous criminal. Anyway, we will have more chance to consider prison sentences as we study the prison. So let me now turn to that, but I will stop for a moment to give you a chance to ask any questions that are on your mind about LWOP and the materials we talked about the last couple of days. Yeah.
I was going to say, based on the idea of this idea of this rationale of hope, that we at least give somebody hope that they might be released. And this is not particularly sound argument, but it just strikes me that given how infrequently people are actually paroled for these offenses, isn't giving them the hope kind of cruel in and of itself? Because, I mean, it's kind of a false hope in a way. It just seems like there's no real...
Right. Well, I take your point. So two things to say about that. One is, we've been making a contrast between life without parole and life with parole, as if parole meant that most people are going to get out of prison at the end of their minimum sentence, or at least well before they've exhausted their time on earth. That certainly was the case up until the 70s and 80s. Most people sent to life in prison got out sometimes ridiculously early, right? You don't want to see a person be murdered back in the neighborhood 7 years, after they got sent away for life, right? That tends to, cut down your sense of what justice means as well as make you a bit scared. But 20, 25 years later, sure. Problem is, governors who, although often they don't have direct power over parole in most states, often feel politically vulnerable because parole is being done by state officers who are under their control. The worst thing that can happen from a governor's point of view is one of those paroled people goes out and commits another heinous crime. And then, guess what? My opponent runs against me next time with a picture of me as if I was married to this guy who just, raped or murdered a bunch of other people. And so politically, my preference if I'm governor is to say no to parole. And in California, the voters gave governors that responsibility and that right in a 1988 ballot initiative. And so, especially in the last 30 years, parole's approached a vanishing point of close to zero. I mean, they never hit zero, but they came close. They're going back up now under Governor Schwarzenegger and Brown, although they're still not near where they were. So, funny thing about hope. For one thing, how realistic is it? I mean, have you ever bought a lottery ticket? A lot of people buy lottery tickets and seem to enjoy that experience, and yet, they have almost a ridiculously low chance of winning, right? It is like lightning striking. So one of the things you'll find if you actually meet people in California who are on life sentences is they know that the odds are low, but it doesn't stop them from having a fair amount of hope, right? And as the advertising for lottery tickets, at least I think it was here in California, used to say, like, if you buy a lottery ticket, you have a right to, gives you the right to daydream about what you'll do with the money. Well, having that possibility of parole gives lifers a tremendous thing to focus on and to kind of channel their energies into. So I don't think it's completely counterproductive or cruel in that sense. Second point is, it's parole needs to be requalified. We went through a period of tremendous public sort of discrediting of parole, and unfortunately, incidents like Philip Burrito, the kidnapper of the little girl who kept her then kidnapped, J.C. Dugard, for 18 years while parole agents visited him regularly, and he was released on a federal parole. So there a lot of people have a very negative view of parole, and it's going to take a lot to win the public's confidence back. But actually, I think that's actually a pretty important task, and so I don't take it lightly that we should leave parole with this rather minimal, very formalistic hope that you could get out. We need a realistic hope that a lot of people are going to get out. And the final thing I'll say is, going back to retribution for a moment, this is one of the reasons I think that it might be possible to have LWOP and dignity at the same time. Is the truth is, as Beckeria predicted, when you actually talk to people doing these very long sentences, it's amazing how much life adjusts, and your horizon of what makes it a good day or a good week changes. And suddenly, there's apple muffins on the menu Saturday night. That's something to look forward to. I mean, people manage to find a way. They find a way, just as people recover from terrible accidents that render them disabled in ways they never would have imagined tolerating, and yet find they can. And so there is a way people can live their lives in prison. I think a lot. If we're going to have prisons and we're going to have people in them for a long time, we ought to do a lot more of our focus ought to be on how to make them places that people can live in dignity. But it's amazing how much work they can do on their own. Yeah.
So I feel like in common discourse, a lot has it's like talked about as being progressive with respect to the death penalty. But last week's lecture, you kind of said how it was representative of our exceptional American punitiveness. So do you think that it's intentionally more punitive, or that it's intentionally a progressive reform that has the unintended net widening Russian consequences?
That's a really good question. First of all, I guess one question is sort of intended by whom. I think there's I don't know that it's intended to be punitive. I think the widespread use of LWOP and its popularity has a lot more to do with, in my view, with fear than it does with sort of a punitive zeal, although those are often tied together in people's minds and it's very hard to disaggregate them. And so I do hold out some hope for sort of reaching people on that. And I think one possibility of sort of sentences, for instance, where instead of having a parole date or be given a guarantee of parole, even parole consideration, you would get a life sentence, and for instance, after 25 years, it would return to court for consideration of whether that life sentence ought to be reset at some length of years, for instance. I think that kind of move could reassure people that they're not going to suddenly turn around and see Joe Blow back on the street again after a few years. That view of parole as a sort of a backdoor to the system that's unlocked and open. So I think if it's fear rather than punitive that's driving it, then to some extent there can be a kind of public dialogue about it, especially in an age when people are more aware of the cost that they're paying to keep people who may be in their septuagenarian phase, in prison. But I think there is also undeniably a net widening impact from it, and unfortunately we'll see that with the birth of the prison. Anytime you come up with a penalty that everyone feels a bit better about than the old penalty because it seems more humane, more dignified, less cruel, etc., it simply becomes easier to use it, right? So there's a paradox. If we get rid of life without parole, and the next ultimate sanction becomes 25 years and then a potential reconsideration, will it be easier to hand that down than it was LWOPs, right? So there's a worry to that. Now, I could be accused of sort of hypocrisy, like, why are you supporting the ballot initiative that would replace the death penalty with life without parole when you yourself say that you're not sure whether life without parole is compatible with human dignity, and therefore it's quite possible that few years from now you're going to be one of those people agitating to remove life without parole. And I plead guilty to hypocrisy because it's, I think, an easy sin to fall into, and I'm sure I have. But I think it would make a difference to take the death penalty off the table in America. I think it has kind of an emotional effect on our very thinking about punishment that makes it hard to make progress or to find common values on other sorts of things, because the enormous excitement and emotional power of death. This is something David Garland writes a lot about in his book. He thinks that, although we don't get to execute people, that the death penalty gives us all these great opportunities to talk about death, and that's what we like doing. We like talking about it, we like hearing about it. It helps us master perhaps our own fear of it. So I think it would, if we took the death penalty off the table, and some years passed and we said, we're sentencing people for very serious crimes, and we don't have the death penalty, and it's okay. Then I think we can take a look at our other penalties. One of the problems we have, and this takes us beyond what we can really cover in this class, is I think the real difficult problems of how do you punish the most serious crimes, like murder. And what about people who murder like 2 or 3 people, right? Or 4 or 5 people, right? And with automatic weapons, the difference between murdering a couple of people and a couple dozen people sometimes becomes vanishingly small. And if you go into a Safeway and start spraying people with bullets, like the man who attempted, Jared Loftner, I guess, the man who attempted to assassinate Representative Giffords from Arizona, killed several people, could have killed dozens without much more culpability than he showed in what he did, right? So it's very hard. And one of the reasons there's a desire for things like the death penalty or life without parole is we want to distinguish some of the worst crimes from other crimes that are really, really bad but not as bad. And we're kind of running out. It's like having only 5 colors of paint and trying to capture more degrees of variation. And I think we need to get more creative. I mean, when we send people to prison, generically in our mind that tends to mean prison. But you can imagine different things. Maybe murderers ought to go to a special kind of prison that has a more severe regimen, not one that would be cruel and unusual in its own right, but maybe more austere, more monastic, more penitent, whatever the right word would be. Maybe after spending the first 20 years of your sentence in that kind of prison, you'd move back to a more normal prison that had rehabilitative programming and educational facilities and things of that nature. There are different ways we could think about this. But at the end of the day, there's also a certain kind of futility in our intuitive desire to match our punitive outrage with punishment. It's one of the reasons people in the old days would dismember the body and dig it up again and dismember it again. There was more punishment than could fit into essentially a human life, even when tortured, etc. And I think even in a much more civilized, to some extent, system, we run up against the same problem. Well, let me plunge ahead, even though I know we'll have time to talk more about the prison and its origins on Thursday. I want to take us a little bit back toward the moment that we looked at some weeks ago now, when we looked at Beccaria's critique of the kind of capital punishment regime, the execution regime that we have studied ad nauseum now over the last few weeks. And the reason I want to emphasize this is, remind you of it, is because when you take Beccaria and then John Howard, who's a very interesting book, The State of the Prisons, I asked you to read the first 35 pages of, thanks to Google, it's now digitized. When you put them together, I put it to you that what you have is a pretty good picture of how the people at the end of the 18th century who eventually gave us the prison thought about what their problem was. That is, what was wrong with the way we punish now, and how do we have to change? That was sort of the question being asked. And it's very interesting to me that we're in a sort of similar moment today, right? We're looking at mass incarceration in cases like Brown versus Plata, and we're saying, this is just wrong. This doesn't look right. It looks like we're doing inhumane things here. They're counterproductive things. They're very costly things. We need to punish differently. But it's not so clear what that looks like. And so we're at a similar moment. So let's think about how Beccaria saw things. So as one of his points here is consideration of how individuals take in the message of punishment, right? This is sort of the birth of the deterrent framework. The weight of punishment should be relative to the condition of the nation itself. Stronger and more palpable impress may be made upon the hardened minds of people who have barely emerged from a state of savagery. But as men's minds become gentler from living in the state of society, so their sensibilities increase. So we know that Beccaria thought that one problem with the scaffold ritual is that it ignored the kind of evolution of social behavior, and the fact that modern European people, at least of the 18th century, were somehow more civilized and could be governed in terms of criminal law with less severe punishments. Of course, there's his very important point about certainty as opposed to severity. Crimes are more effectively prevented by the certainty than the severity of punishment, for it is in the nature of mankind to be terrified at the approach of the smallest inevitable evil, whilst hope, there you go, the best gift of heaven, hath the power of dispelling the apprehension of a greater, especially if supported by examples of impunity, which weakness or avarice too frequently afforded. So we know that one of the problems with the death penalty was it was severe in principle, but there was a lot of reason to believe that you might be spared the death penalty. So whatever deterrent value it had in terms of its severity was considerably undermined by the lack of certainty. And indeed, the discussion we were just having about the propensity of people to hope on the basis of very little rational grounds meant that somebody thinking about whether to commit a murder or a robbery would be especially undeterred by the prospect that they might escape the noose. Another point of Beccaria's. It is important that men should frequently be shown the power of the law. Then the exactions of the death penalty must follow quickly one upon another, which supposes a frequency of crime. So he points out, look, in order to deter people, you need punishments happening all the time and the consequences of crime all around people so that they're constantly reminded of the wages of misbehavior. The problem with executions, well, they only happen, even in London, they only happen a few times a year. And ironically, if we want it to happen more often, we have to hope that there'll be more serious crimes so that we'll have people to hang. So punishment is too erratic. We need a more continuous, more frequent, more essentially available, if not necessarily always visible, punishment. And these are summarized again in some of these points. It's not the intensity of pain, which most greatly affects the mind, but its continuance. So you need a punishment that is ongoing and not just frequent. The penalty of death makes an impression which, for all its strength, cannot counterbalance that rapid forgetfulness, which is the nature of man, even in his most essential affairs. Again, unless it's repeated, its power is lost. It's a spectacle, and that kind of spectacle may generate indignation or even compassion for the condemned. Indeed, Beccaria thought the death penalty might be teaching just the wrong lesson. By showing a barbaric killing of a human being as authoritative and positive, it might be setting a terrible lesson for how people ought to resolve their own conflicts or when they feel they're in the right. And again, he thought that these very severe penalties, erratically given, would tend to generate almost a kind of rebellious attitude on the part of offenders who might say, well, I'd rather take my chances and live like a well-born person, and then if I have to pay the price on the scaffold, I'm willing to pay that price. It's a short day of pain, as the quote puts it. So pull back for a moment. If you had Beccaria here and asked him, okay, cut to the chase. What do you want? What do you think punishment should be? You told us at great length what's wrong with the punishments we have. And you come up with something like the following. It's got to be certain. It's got to be frequently handed down and delivered. It's got to either be visible or readily comprehensible to people that it's happening. There has to be signs of it, but not disruptive or something that would tend to send the wrong message, right? If you think about the hanging day festivities at Tyburn, from the way they might seem to a economically minded philosopher like Beccaria at the end of the 18th century, it's a great, huge party, right? This is not a way to instill order and respect for good behavior, discipline, thriftiness, hard work, all those good values that we're promoting. We're having a huge holiday at which people get drunk and watch somebody hanged. That hardly looks like the kind of social pedagogy that we want punishment to be engaged in. So that gives you your kind of deterrent Beccarian vision of what was wrong with the scaffold. Plenty of terror, plenty of pathos, but overall, not the kind of consistent, reliable, easily imagined sort of pain treatments that would be necessary to keep people very clear in their mind that crime does not pay. More or less at the same time as Beccaria, and quite in sympathy with him. You saw that he quotes Beccaria here, right? Beccaria is kind of like the strand that runs through everybody's writing in this period, is John Howard, very interesting man. Howard, born in a relatively aristocratic English family. He fights in one of the innumerable wars between England and France in those years, and he ends up a prisoner, actually, of the French. This is in a period where the treatment of prisoners of war was pretty terrible, and they were often held for ransom and things of this nature. He was wealthy, so when he came home and recovered, he didn't really have to do anything. That's the good thing about being an aristocrat in those days. You just have a lot of land. But he decided that as a proper gentleman, he should do something that had a kind of public service aspect. So he became sheriff of his local area, Bedfordshire. And sheriffs are, among other things, responsible here in this country. They're responsible for running the jail and administering the jail. Not in Howard's day. That was given to other officials. In Howard's day, though, they did have the power and responsibility to inspect the jails. Now, for the most part, this probably just gave aristocrats an opportunity to go visit the jail and make sure that the jailer gave them a very good meal and maybe a couple of bottles of brandy to take home with him. But Howard took it very, very seriously. And what he saw in English jails and then when he visited the continent of Europe absolutely horrified him. And it led him, as it led Beccaria in his own way, to write a book. And this book, called The State of the Prisons, was another one of these kind of bestsellers of the 18th century. We obviously have no Amazon numbers to tell us exactly how well it sold. But we do know that it showed up in libraries of literate and learned people throughout North America and in Europe. There's a tremendous amount of artwork from the end of the 18th century that shows various scenes of Howard visiting jails and also asylums for the insane, or lazarettos, as they were sometimes called in Europe, workhouses, other places where people were very poor or the ill or the criminal were kept. And of course, debtors. One of the things you learn when you're reading Howard's State of the Jails is that the most typical person in an English jail in the 18th century wasn't a criminal offender, but was a debtor. If you fell into debt, as for instance Charles Dickens' father did, you and your whole family could essentially be placed in a jail. It was a form of essentially security, right? So you don't skip out on your debt, but it was also obviously a way to put maximum pressure on you to come up with the money you owe. In any event, Howard's book had a powerful effect on the European imagination and the American imagination as well. It's as if these images of squalid, chaotic, heterogeneous dungeons that were the jails and asylums of Europe became for many Europeans and Americans, American colonialists, a kind of paradigm of what the kind of fallen and corrupted state of the social world that they lived in, as well as the potential of Enlightenment ideas, right, to come in and sweep them clean and open up a new era of rational policies of the sort that Beccaria was pursuing, right? So in this, unfortunately, highly distorted image, it's actually a wonderful, very powerful etching by George Romney, who was a late 18th century artist. It was actually done in ink and wash, and you can see it in London. And I'm sorry it's in such bad form here, but what you can see is enough is that image of Enlightenment. That's Howard, right? And his very body is sort of draped in the light that he's bringing in. He's a physical embodiment of the idea of Enlightenment. Here's another image of him visiting a jail, and you can see a typical scene, perhaps, of debtors, right? So this isn't your sort of felon. This is a family. They're living on sort of straw and whatnot in essentially this dungeon. And here's Howard. He's probably speaking with the jailer here, and you see him doing his work of inspecting the prison. So this was, again, it's hard to capture this. It would be sort of like Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, or some of the classic books that have sort of scandalized, the literate social world at a particular time or on a particular issue, and it did so in this case with respect to jails. And it's very interesting how this ties up with the idea of what to do about the death penalty, because this is, as we've already revisited many times, this is the period where the first wave of abolition fervor is reaching its peak, and Howard, who's probably not unsympathetic to this, he writes, I leave to others the discussion of the question whether those executions were too numerous. He's pointed out that he's got a table, something that we would have liked to look at, right? A table of how many people were executed in London each year and for what crimes during the middle of the 18th century. And he says, I'll leave it to others to decide whether there were too many of these executions. And it may be left to anyone to judge whether, including debtors and petty offenders, the number of those who died in the several London prisons of jail fever does not exceed the number of those that were executed annually during the time. In other words, he can say, look, don't get me going about whether the death penalty is uncivilized or cruel or something we should get rid of. We're killing people that we just sent to jail. Some of them not even criminals, just debtors. And so he's found a way to take that kind of fervor about the death penalty and turn it into an even more powerful critique of the jail. And it raises